I still want my relationship with my partner and I want the intimacy there. So like what boundaries do I have to have in place with work and what kind of communication
Mhm.
do we have to have around this? And yeah, I think like I mean sex work, but then like you said, like everything around it, like the communication, all of that stuff, it was extremely transformational and like
Mm.
I'm absolutely not the same person that I would have been if I'd chosen a different path or if I hadn't explored all of that. And it makes it really hard to like fully forever close that door. Like I always hated the term like retired. Like I don't
Mhm.
want to be like retired or retired sex worker.
But the majority of us go back and forth, or I don't know if
Yeah,
that's totally true, but
I think it
I
is.
know Raven Bowen did a study on it, and I think that was the reflection of her data, was that the majority of us go back and forth in and out of the industry. And
Yeah,
I definitely am one of those people. I mean, that's the reason my book was, it encapsulates 27 years of going in and out of the industry and the reasons why I went back.
yeah,
And the whole point you made about what's really degrading, really. You know, to me, pouring ketchup into bottles and cleaning up people's messy tables and then having them yell at me because they didn't like the food or something, that's degrading to me. You know,
yeah,
I've done it and I would do it again if I had to make a living. I'm not
yeah,
saying that, you know, it's a horrible job, but jobs all have their good points and their bad points. And to me personally, working for minimum wage, especially, or any kind of low hourly rate, and then also on top of it, either not being appreciated or actually being treated like shit, that's way more degrading than
yeah.
taking off my clothes and being admired and having money thrown at me. You know?
Yeah, I mean, like I think the foundational thing that I hear you saying there and that I kind of always come back to as well, it's just that like sex work is work and
Mhm.
we know that, we say that like over and over again, but that is what it comes down to and we get to make the decision about what is degrading and what isn't.
Yes.
I don't
Welcome to the Fearless Living Podcast.
Welcome to the Fearless Living Podcast. I'm your host, Annie Temple, and my guest today is fellow author Cid V. Brunet, who wrote This Is My Real Name about their experience working as a stripper in Canada. And other things, of course, because nobody's life is just boiled down to one thing that they did as a job. With recent poetry publications in CV2 and Eavesdrop magazine, they currently work as the editor of reviews at PRISM, an international literary magazine. Cid is currently working on a historical fiction novel. That sounds fascinating. Cid spent 10 plus years working in the sex industry. They primarily worked as a dancer at strip clubs across Canada. Their memoir describes these experiences through their protagonist, Michelle. This Is My Real Name is described as intensely personal. It demystifies stripping as a career with great respect and candor, while at the same time exploring the complex, sex positive relationships that make it meaningful. I just love that description. And I agree because I read the book. Sid currently lives in Montreal, where they enjoy weightlifting. Ooh, cool. And caring for an ever-growing collection of houseplants while attempting to stay socially and politically engaged. And I'm just going to add that I read Sid's book after writing the first draft of my own memoir, and I'd gone on like a sex worker memoir kick. And I read a lot of well-known and some not very well-known books that I was able to find. And I'm still finding out about books that I never heard of why didn't I find them in my search? It was so weird, but uh, I was fortunate to be connected with some of these authors by following them on social media, including Sid. And I had the opportunity to ask Sid to be a guest on my podcast. And I'm so happy that you were willing to do that.
yeah, me
Today, we're
too.
going to talk about just things in general, but also we do have a lot in common in the aspect of both being writers and both being people who work in the adult or have worked in the adult entertainment industry and who have written memoirs about it and released them to the world. So thank you for being here, Sid. And can you please, in your own words, tell us a little bit about yourself so that my guests can get a sense of who you are?
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. I think this is like the I'm pretty sure this is the first time that I've been interviewed by another sex worker, so I'm super excited about that. Yeah, primarily, I think primarily now I identify as like a writer. I don't think I would have always said that. It's very much like in the last few years that I've switched from having being a writer as something that I really want to do to being more of like that is what I am. Um, yeah, I'm pretty introverted. I have like an at-home office where I spend a lot of my time. Yeah, and I kind of go through, so like sometimes I've also done a lot of work in like harm reduction. I worked at like a safe injection site in Montreal for a while. So I kind of like move in and out of phases of doing more kind of active solidarity, mutual aid, that kind of work, and then go through other periods where I'm more introverted or more working on my writing. And these days I'm currently doing NaNoWriMo, which is like a National Novel Writing Month day, and it not day, month, but it's every November, and literally anybody can join. So if that's something you're like, oh, that's cool, you should check it out. It's like a free kind of community that people can be a part of for November. So the goal of that is to do like 50,000 words in November, and that's what I'm trying to do in terms of my first draft. And it's been very all-encompassing these days. So yeah,
That is a lot for 1 month,
totally.
50,000. To give an idea to people what that looks like, I think my memoir is about 65,000, or at least one of my novels is about 65,000, I think, words. And that's the thickness of a full novel or a full book. Like that's a long ass story.
Yeah, my wrists are already sore from the typing. It's a
No
lot.
doubt. Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, it took me at least a year. I think a year is the minimum it has taken me to write an entire book. So
Wow,
well
that's
done
fast
if you
though.
could do that in a month. That's amazing.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's like it wouldn't be complete in that time. It's
Hmm.
just to like I'm trying to write a first draft and I'm sure I'll
Yes.
write many, many drafts. Like recently somebody was like, "Oh, well, it's a first draft. Like how many drafts until it's finished? Like three?" And I was like, No, like tw 12 to 15. I don't know."
I know. And I think like that is the secret to that I've found for me in my writing process is not to get caught up in rereading and editing what I've already written, but to get it all out on paper. I just give myself permission to write shit because I know I can edit it 12 to 15 times and really tighten it up and expand on it and change it and delete it and you know.
Totally. Yeah, and like on that theme, I've heard it called like the way that I'm trying to think about it is like a puke draft is how I've heard it described. But it's similar what you just said. Like you write shit, you just get it out. And really sometimes I think the hardest part is just putting the words on the page.
Mhm.
For me, my protagonist, like because I've done a lot of work in nonfiction, it's been difficult to have like a fictional sort of protagonist and
Mhm.
to connect with her. And so the process of writing is also teaching me about her now, and that's been good.
No doubt. As someone who has written fiction and nonfiction as well, it is a completely, entirely different beast. So, so drastically different and so exciting and creative to do fiction. Like I love it. I know that one day that kind of that'll probably be like what I want to focus on. But right now I'm in a nonfiction stage where I want to write about intimacy and now that I'm done my memoir, oh, this is a question I have for you, which I hadn't intended to ask, but it just popped in my head. Did you feel after writing your memoir like you could now put your past behind you in a sense, in like a almost a spiritual sense, and be able to move forward into what's coming next? Because I felt like I was not closing a door, but just closing a chapter and being able to look forward to the rest of my life when I published my memoir. It was kind of
Mm,
I don't know. Did you experience that at all?
yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I love kind of jumping into the heart of it like that. Yeah, in some ways I did feel that way. I think like I've kind of gone back a few times after that, but like once like where the memoir ends is kind of like where regular working did end for me. I wouldn't say that it
Mhm.
was like the end, but and I didn't know that at the time. But I think like yeah, like I the second that I like stepped into a strip club, I was like I want to write about this and being a writer, like I wanted to write about everything, but I knew that in
Mhm.
particular the sex work industry was fascinating um to me and to other people. So in an ongoing way, I was making sure that I was, using like a notes app on my phone and having like an ongoing Google document of just like snippets of conversation that I would overhear or like bits of dialogue or just like images and kind of having like a pretty long standing document that I could add to all of the time. It really
Wow.
gave me a lot to look back on when I started like actively writing the memoir. And yeah, because for me like it's a very contained memoir. It's sort of like 10 years. So it doesn't
Mhm.
well, I refused. I didn't want to talk about my childhood, so I didn't really. But I didn't want
I
to talk about the
didn't
childhood.
either.
Oh, really? I love
Yeah.
that. People always ask. They're like, "What? Why didn't you? Whatever, whatever." And like that's the thing that I tell people who are like afraid of writing their story down. It's like you still get to make choices. You still are the
Mhm.
one who gets to like make the judgment calls of what goes in and what doesn't. And
Mhm.
yeah, all in a roundabout way of saying that like I did sort of feel like it was very packaged. Like the thing that I put together was like 10 years and it felt very like complete, even if my
Mhm.
own personal story with sex work didn't feel like it was like over when I hit the end. It
Mhm.
did feel like I was able to encapsulate a certain degree of that career for sure.
Yeah, that's beautiful way to put it. I can relate to the idea of not like I started my memoir uh a month before I started, or just over a month before I started stripping. That's where I started my story in my memoir. I do have, like you, some reflections back to childhood, to certain conversations or whatnot, throughout the book because they're kind of relevant to context for whatever situation, but I don't really go into my childhood or a lot that happened. I do make a reference to one of the traumas I had as a teenager where I was sexually assaulted, but I don't go into details about it or anything. And then the
Mhm.
other thing that I found was I didn't want to tell other people's stories. So the puke right or whatever it's called
Yeah, the
the
puke
puke
draft. Yep.
draft, yeah, that had a lot of other people's stories in it because I was just letting myself write whatever came into my head. So it had stories of my brothers, my partners, and when I actually went to edit multiple times, I started to take out other people's stories because I didn't feel that I had the right to tell other people's stories. So I tried to really just focus on my own perspective. But getting back to your book, because I really enjoyed reading it for so many reasons, but one of the main reasons was that you didn't use the real names of the clubs, which I
Mm.
didn't realize at first, because at first I think you were talking about clubs that were mostly out east where I've never worked. So I didn't realize at first, but then when you started talking about some of the clubs that I was like, I know what club this is. And then I started to be like, oh, the names have been changed. Sid changed the names of some of these clubs. And so um did you feel like a nervous, like just out of curiosity, was that a decision made to protect yourself legally or what? Because I know that was a consideration for me. I consulted with a lawyer when I was writing my memoir. Um, so I'm curious to what prompted you to use the fake names of the strip clubs.
Totally. Yeah, I did try to I tried to change any identifying details. And that goes for like places, but also for people. Um, and I do, refer to a lot of other people and um, there's many other characters that aren't me, but I did try to like obscure and obfuscate and make sure as best I could that it wasn't easily identifiable.
Hmm.
And I do know like I do have a lot of fun when people come up and they have worked at the places and they can guess, but it's luckily it seems to be only the people who've worked there who are able to identify and differentiate the different places. But
Totally.
I find that readers almost find out like an Easter egg, especially if they've worked themselves. They can kind of point it out because yeah, I did have a lot of experiences kind of across the country. So I I've never actually counted. I don't know how many places it was in total. Um, yeah, maybe that's a good question for me for later. But yeah, like, did you find you had a lot of people like asking you for the details that you'd chosen not to include? Like
So
stuff about
far,
your
I think,
childhood, your
yeah, so far
parents.
my book is so new. I don't know because I just released it in the last few weeks. I think what people are expecting from sex worker memoirs and what they don't get from mine, and I didn't really get from yours either. And I think that could be because we're very activism types or, socially sensitive types. My book isn't focused on like the sex part of the
Mm,
sexuality part of the industry. I read a lot of other memoirs where like they got right into details, like a male stripper that talked about like what the women would do to him at the parties and a porn actress who writes about, learning how to do these really crazy scenes and being prepared and the first time that she allowed Greek and that kind of thing. So
mm,
on film. And so this was fascinating for me to read, but my memoir is not like that at all. My memoir is really more about like how I saw my industry as a job and then how that job impacted every other aspect of my life because especially the stigma but also the hours that it
hmm.
involves, the some of the risks that it obviously are involved. And I'm
Yeah.
I'm coming from like the heterosexual point of view too. So reading your book was also very educational for me. So I
Hmm.
I, I just think it's fascinating to get inside other people's minds. You feel like I feel like I almost know you because I read your book. You know
That's
what I
great.
mean? And I feel that's one of the reasons why I actually recorded mine onto an audiobook because I've been listening to audiobooks lately and in particular a few memoirs. And I literally feel like I'm friends with Chandler Bing, even though
Totally.
he's passed away and that's not even his real name, but because I listened to that voice and I watched that show for years and then I listened to his voice tell his own story and that was just so powerful. But
Yeah.
but yeah, it's
That,
very fascinating. So maybe I'll get into like what are you currently doing right now? We talked a bit about your writing with a group, which that's very interesting too. I'm curious, like, do you feel I always feel uncomfortable almost joining mainstream types of groups because I fear that I won't fit in or that people will judge me because of the type of writing that I do or that kind of thing.
what group do you mean?
So the November writing, isn't it like a
Oh,
community?
yeah, totally. But it's very dispersed. It's a very online
Okay.
community. Yeah.
So you're
Um,
more anonymous, I guess. Is that right?
basically
Hmm.
I'm treating that as more of like a self challenge. Like it's I'm lucky enough that I have made certain friends through the program as well as like knowing people just in general. And then
Hmm.
I've run like last winter, I ran a writing group just for sex workers. Um,
Cool.
yeah, which was super great because I find like so many sex workers want to be able to tell their story, and it's not always like in memoir form. Like there's lots of poets or comic artists or like documentarians of a different kind, like film people,
Hmm.
artists, you know what I mean? And people have a lot of those questions, I find, especially about like, how did you deal with legality? How did you deal with anonymity? How did you deal with like the ethics of like, yeah, what you said, talking about other people or
Hmm.
talking about real places and people, well, sex workers that I have spoken with who are artists have a lot of fear of putting their work out into the world of repercussion and of stigma. And And what I try to say to people is that it's worth it to try to work to a place where you feel comfortable and you can get it out. And
Mhm.
sometimes for people, that's not, like the choice to put my name, the choice to call it, this is my real name, right? But then the choice to like write my own name as part of that instead of choosing a different pen name or attempting to be a more anonymous figure, that's not the choice for everybody, especially
Mhm.
because like, you know, stigma and stereotypes and also the differing levels of like privilege and hierarchy and all that kind of stuff comes into play when people are
Sure.
bringing forward like vulnerable information. And I actually don't know, are you Canadian or are you American?
I'm Canadian.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
I live in
So we,
BC.
yeah, okay. And we have like a little bit of a different situation than the States, obviously, but there are still legal concerns. And I
Hmm.
did make sure that my publisher ran specific sections through their lawyer. Um,
Nice.
and I had a lot of fear, me too, publishing it.
Mhm.
I think my fear was a lot based around like recrimination, maybe from any of the clubs if they, and I've been really lucky, like knock on wood. But some of that fear still really kicks around. And I think if I could go back to the beginning and kind of start again, I would have probably paid for my own lawyer. I would have like
Mhm.
done that myself and not necessarily just left that to my publisher. Because at the end of the day, the writer is the one who is responsible.
Mhm.
And so, but then that's a lot of the reason why folks like when people are being like, I really want to tell my story, but I'm afraid of XYZ. Um, that's when I kind of have conversations with people about, well, could you tell it in fiction and could you still get the same kind of catharsis? Or could you write this as a poem where there's no like POV, there's no I behind it?
Mhm.
Um, and that's why having like, multi-genres or different ways that people express themselves is especially important for sex workers because it gives you a bit more room. Like I chose to publish This Is My Real Name as a memoir because I knew that I wanted to stand behind it and to talk about my specific experiences as they happen to me. But I
Mhm.
know other people could still have a lot of power and would still want to tell aspects of that story, but not necessarily have the kind of public scrutiny of being like, oh, this happened to you for all kinds of reasons.
Mhm.
Um,
For sure.
immigration status, or like there's just so many reasons why people wouldn't want to attach a memoir that talks about, being a sex worker,
For
or
sure.
mine talks about using substances.
Mhm.
So I understand that fear. And so it's kind of like oftentimes when I work with sort of groups of sex workers explicitly, it's more about like what parts of that fear do you want to work through? What parts can you challenge through like finding out, through like writing it and then contacting a lawyer and like, yeah. So yeah, just that there's many ways that I think people can bring their truth to light and it doesn't have to be like nonfiction in order for it to like count and to be
Mhm.
effective and to like get the writer what they want.
That's beautiful. I love that. Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I've done some fiction writing, like I said, and there's a message in my fiction writing, which is about challenging our belief systems, what we've been conditioned to believe, whatnot, and that kind of thing. And my fiction is targeted towards youth. So I use an
Mhm.
entirely different name because nobody's going to want their children reading a book written by a sex worker, but I'm a mother, and talking about privilege too, I really can relate to that because I do feel very privileged. I'm privileged that I came out early on in my sex work career so that I got accustomed to being uh, being questioned about my decisions and having to face uncomfortable situations where people, like teachers at my kid's school or whatever would be like, "Oh, I saw you in the newspaper talking about stripping," you know? And and now I still have a child that's in school. I have two children that are adults, but one that's still in school. And uh, I really had to ask myself, like, are my children strong enough to handle this too? And that's a privilege. If my children are strong enough and love me enough and supportive enough that they could handle me releasing a memoir to the world. So I had my fears more stemmed. I did have those fears about recriminations from like I really kind of trash talk agents in my book, and and I had some good ones, right? And I do mention that too, but I do, they were the bane of my existence as a stripper. So there is some trash talking going on there, and but I didn't name anyone, so that was part of my way of avoiding legalities. And I also tried to, like, for instance, I talked about the agents in Winnipeg who were not very nice to me. But I said, a lot of dancers, because I know so many who absolutely love the guys that run the agency in Winnipeg, and they have great relationships with them. I don't love them. I did not have a good experience with them, So I acknowledge that, my experience might be different from other people's. And so I hope that some of those things that I said, like qualifiers, would deflate some of the anger that people might have towards me if they read my words. The lawyer I consulted said basically, as long as they can't prove that what you said is a lie, you're okay. Uh,
Interesting.
so for me, that was very encouraging. I just made sure everything that I said was definitely not a lie and couldn't be proven to be a lie. And if I wasn't sure about something, like for instance, at the beginning of one of my chapters, I said, honestly, years of sickness, health issues, and age have, made my memory fuzzy. And I'm going to write it the
Hmm.
way I remember it, but I could possibly be getting some of this wrong, because a lot of that stuff was during a period when I was involved in a lot of activism and events, and other people might remember it differently than I did, you know?
And
So,
that's human,
yeah, so that was a
right?
big
Like
part.
just because we're memorized doesn't mean we have a perfect memory. And
Yes, exactly.
I feel like I have to address that a lot because like a lot of the scenes that I'm writing about are accompanied by like drug and alcohol use and
Mhm.
there's a lot going on and like also mental health is like a big thing that happens to me and a number of times during that
Mhm.
book it's more or less present. Um
And that always colors your perspective.
yeah, but I think it's like the story like one of my mentors said this thing where she was like your responsibility is to convey the emotional truth of the events to people. And then things like the exact dates that things happened, like that's not as important in creative nonfiction or something like that. You're
Mhm.
still attempting to get like a story arc. You're still trying to find like pleasing and interesting ways to tell a story. Um, so yeah, I didn't feel too bad about kind of like obfuscating some of that
Mhm.
stuff to keep me feeling safer and because I still felt like I was able to convey the emotional truth or the impacts of those things on me.
Mhm.
Um, and it's just challenging. Like one of the things that I can talk about is like my relationship with the first partner who I'm talking about in the book. We don't have a relationship. Like I don't speak with him because that relationship was abusive and ended not well. Um,
Mhm.
and so I took his parts in and out a lot. Like there was many drafts of that where I just kind of tried to not talk about him at all because yeah, his story's not my story and he has a lot going on and I have like a ton of compassion for both of us during
Yeah.
that time, like where we were both at. Um, but like at the bottom line, it got to a point where my story didn't really make sense without
Yeah.
understanding him and the dynamics of our relationship at that time. So I made that choice of being like, well, even though like I can't get the consent for this thing, I'm going to go ahead, like the consent being consent to tell him that I'd written about a character who was similar to him or, represented him in my life in the story.
Yes.
Um, I felt like I still needed to go ahead with that because it made my story make sense. So every writer is going to have those choices. And I think a lot of people choose to go in a fiction direction. And fiction can be so helpful because it really allows people to kind of explore and to kind of like breathe a bit of sigh of relief. Because with memoir, there's like a lot of internalized, and I heard it in what you were saying too, but like internalized kind of pressure because we are very concerned with the truth. We do want to portray things as they are, truthfully. And one of your questions had been like, what is very important to you? And that was the first thing that came to mind to me was like truth, portraying truthful things.
Mhm.
And that's really important in like what I'm doing kind of now, which is like working on this I mean it's historical fiction, but it's based on a true story. And I'm working with a family member who had her great great grandmother was part of the British Home Children, which is something that I'd never heard of before, but basically like Britain shipped its orphans to its different colonies to serve as indentured laborers. And so for me, I thought like working on this project would be kind of like a break from the deep emotional toll that writing kind of like takes on me spiritually. Because I was like, well, it's not writing about myself. Like I don't have to go back and be like, oh, let me just like re-edit that traumatic scene like again and again and again,
Oh my God, I know.
But funnily enough, it just like, even though it's fiction, even though I'm fictionalizing a lot of this new story, it's still like digging through the archives and it's still taking like scraps of information and then imagining what that means for any given person. And
Mhm.
so I think for me, like this story, the protagonists are children, and I'd never intentionally wanted to write about children, but I found this story so compelling. Anyway,
No doubt.
yeah,
Wow,
yeah,
it sounds fascinating. I mean, I'll definitely be buying your book when you're done it. I know it takes a while to get through these things, especially something like a historical fiction. I imagine there must be so much intense research around
yeah,
something like that, and then trying to get to know people with similar stories so that you can get a sense of personality and context. And I mean, my
yeah.
favorite books are historical fiction books. They're my
Me
favorite.
too. Yeah, when you can
Yeah.
just like totally go into a world
Hmm.
and I think that's what like memoir offers a different kind of that. Like it really good memoirs, you can find yourself totally wrapped up in that person and the way that they see the world.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, no, I also love historical fiction, and I think going forward, I want to be able to have just a clear, like the kind of clarity that when you're writing a memoir and you're remembering something, I want to be able to have that in fiction.
Mm.
Like that kind of the clarity of thought, the clarity of expression, being able to like see the whole scene. Um, but that's something I'm going to have to learn how to do. And I'm very grateful for like school and different
No
kind of
doubt.
mentors and stuff like that because it's really hard to pull together, well, researching. Like I'm teaching myself how to
Yes.
research right now and like
That's a huge lift, dude. Like I
yeah.
mad props to you because like as a someone who's written fiction, my fiction's more fantasy fiction type of stuff with like sorcerers
Oh
and
yeah.
dragons and mermaids and stuff like that. It was my kid's idea when I first started writing it. And I find my research centers around like mythical beings and the powers that they have and that kind of thing. But I'm still left with so much creative license. Whereas when you go into like a historical fiction, like every time I read one, I'm just like amazed by the research that was done and what I learn about that time period and what those people were going through. And
Totally.
it's just I can imagine what a challenge it is, and I just have to say like bravo for taking on that challenge.
Thanks.
Honestly, it's intimidating.
Yeah. And you said you're working on like nonfiction, you're working on intimacy, you're writing about
Yeah,
intimacy.
yeah.
Cool. Is
I'm
that through
writing a
like a
book about,
personal
yeah.
narrative kind of method
Yes,
or what?
kind of. Like it's basically what I did with this book. It's mostly written. I have to start my editing. I haven't started editing yet, so I haven't even done the first edit.
Hmm.
So there's going to be a lot of that going on, and I need to introduce my sections and whatnot. But it's what it is basically each chapter is a little anecdote of why I of context for the person who's reading, usually a story from my life or someone that I've interacted with in my life. And then I go into the framework for applying that information into your life. So every chapter is focused on different things like shame, body shame. Shame and body shame are two different chapters because obviously They cover different kinds of shame and that's, overcoming tragedy. Because intimacy, a lot of what I feel intimacy is about is self-work. It starts with a lot of self-work, and then it goes into learning how to be effective in relationships, how to have good communication. And then when you have all that, then you can really dive into the good sex part, in my opinion. And sex and intimacy are not the same thing, but a lot of people do conflate the two. So I do have a whole section on sex and sexuality, and even people who have to live in sexless lives, because of surgeries, medications, partners that don't want to have sex. So many different reasons, but I've had so many different reasons for going through periods of my life that I can really relate to people in a lot of ways in terms of intimacy. So that book I'm really excited about, but I've also got a new book I'm starting, which is
Oh,
going to
wow.
be, I know,
Prolific.
I'm like full of ideas. I don't have enough time to write. But the next one I'm really excited to write that I'm focusing on now is going to be targeted to men specifically, men
Oh,
who
interesting.
see sex workers in
Yeah.
particular, and who struggle to find romance in their personal lives because they fear to put themselves out there. And I just run
Huh.
into so many people in my business as an intimacy provider, and I've also started doing coaching.
Hmm.
And it's just a very common scenario that I'm coming across is these wonderful men who don't realize their own wonderfulness and are too intimidated and for many different reasons don't want to put themselves out there. So that's my next book I'm really excited about too. As soon as I start
Yeah.
going into a new book, I start losing interest in my old.
Yeah. Of course. That's really cool. I think like one of the things, like one of the major pieces of like feedback that I got, I remembered so when it was still in the editing stages, the feedback that one of my editors kept giving me was like your partner person, so like the person who I end up like in the long-term relationship with, my editor was like, he's just not believable. Like he's like not, he's just too good. He just like does too many nice things. Like I don't get it. Like what's his deal or whatever. And at first I was really hurt by that comment. And I was kind of like, I interpret that as you're saying that sex workers are not deserving of love. Like you're saying that we are like,
Mm.
we don't deserve to have partners who treat us well. Like that's ridiculous. But then I kind of settled down and was like, no, it's just a critique about the character. And it's just a critique about like how I wrote it. So
Mhm.
what we ended up doing was we like went and just he and I like recorded a conversation with each other where we like talk about things like, what is your stance on like on patriarchy and like how do you feel about sex work and what does sex work and society's idea of sex work make you think about your masculinity and like in what ways did you have to challenge those kind of things in order to like remain in good relationship with a sex worker instead of like attempting to control me or trying to get me to quit
Mm.
or having these kind of like crises of masculinity that I saw so many of the male partners of women who were around me working, like going
Mhm.
through, like really struggling with.
Yeah.
Um, and so one like review of the book said that my partner, whose name is Luke in that book, is like the antithesis of patriarchy, which I thought was really interesting because like I don't know if I would have said that that was what I was like looking for in a partner.
Mhm.
Even I wasn't even necessarily looking for like a male partner,
Mhm.
And I think in a lot of ways it would have been easier not to have a male partner being a bisexual person,
Mhm.
and doing sex work. But uh, I think he really taught me a lot about what not toxic masculinity can look like in terms of like
Mhm.
support and care and like respecting my autonomy for my body and that I get to choose what I do with that and that like what I do with my body doesn't like paint him badly or doesn't like
Mhm. Reflect on
put
him.
stigma totally, yeah, make him a stigmatized person or something like
Mhm.
that. And it was actually only recently that we like kind of went back and sort of talked really more in depth about that stuff and I he opened up a little bit more and I was able to understand actually how difficult that process was for him because he didn't show
Yeah.
me a lot of that. It was very internal as he was like working through the shame and the stigma. And, meanwhile, sex workers have our own shame and stigma piled on us. So it's like I couldn't
Mhm.
help him with that because I'm dealing with my own put on me from like other people and
Yeah.
the internalized stuff, which can sometimes be, the hardest to work through. But yeah, so I think that's a really interesting approach to take to be like, what do, thinking about the clients of sex workers, especially knowing that you've done a lot of like other work as well,
Mhm.
to frame that. Yeah,
Yeah. That's
it's
thank you so much for sharing that. That really reminds me of like I recently became single. My partner and I split up for not anything to do with my work. A lot of people think that.
mm,
Weirdly, when I say that my
I
partner and
bet.
I split up, they just assume it's
Yeah.
because he couldn't handle my work. No, that wasn't the problem. Actually, he was my best friend and very supportive of my work and actually gave me great ideas and advice and was
Mm,
often more compassionate about the difficult situations I found myself in and the people that would piss me off than I was. So that I think that that's a stereotype for sure for people to just assume that every man can't handle a woman doing this work. And I think a lot of the reason people struggle is the stigma and how they worry about it reflecting on them. But also just the conditioning in our society that we're cheapened by doing this work, or that they should be embarrassed that, to be with someone like us, or, just fears that we're going to leave them. That a lot of men who date sex workers get super jealous, and I think jealousy is epidemic in every part of the population, male or female or whatever gender. But that
agreed.
there are
Yeah.
people who have done the self work or for whatever reason naturally are not jealous. And I think if you work in this industry, you definitely have to find someone who can control their jealousy and work through it, or are not very jealous, you know?
Yeah, it certainly helps. Like my partner and I have always had like an open relationship and so that kind of structure, like the ideas and ethos of polyamory, like those kinds of things have like really helped and been pretty foundational, I think, to yeah, to supporting a partner who does sex
It
work
builds
sometimes.
communication, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
my partner and I, my ex-partner, um, before I started working as an intimacy provider, I was just doing square jobs for a while, and I didn't think that he would be okay with it. I just assumed. See, there you go again, right? I just assumed he
Hmm.
wouldn't be okay with it. But when I brought it up to him, the idea of doing sensual massage, he was open to it. And then he ended up being totally fine with it. And what ended up happening is he started to become more comfortable to open up to me about his kinks, his desires, uh,
Hmm.
some of the things that he had pushed down out of shame, not even sexual, but just in general, because our communication opened up so significantly when I started working in this industry again, while I was in the relationship with him, that it just, and then like we also had, I wouldn't say, I don't know how to describe, I'm not really up on the whole polyamory type of lingo, but we had ethical non-monogamy for sure, because I had my work, which I enjoyed,
Hmm.
and I would encourage him to see providers, and once in a while we would see a provider together or apart. And that was kind of a fun thing that we did. And we went through phases where we didn't do that at all, and phases where we kind of did it a little more. And
Hmm.
but it was just the fact that we could talk to each other about those things, just the communication aspect itself. It really brought us so incredibly close. And I think that's a byproduct of open or polyamorous or non-ethical, non-monogamous relationships for a lot of people, is that they actually get closer, and people don't realize that. They make
Totally.
assumptions that it's all just toxic. But
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wrote down because I thought that was very profound how you said intimacy is self-work.
mhm,
I've definitely found that to be true in so many different ways over like so much time. And
mhm.
yeah,
Well, we have to be
Absolutely.
intimate with ourselves first.
Yeah,
This is
yeah. And like that's
scary.
part of like the writing process too. Like
Hmm.
I that brings me back to kind of the beginning when you were like, did this kind of encapsulate something? And yeah, it encapsulated like a particular time of doing a certain kind of work, of being like, I will not be ashamed of my body. I will like, and like like I will it's not really putting myself first, but it's being like, I actually refuse to work for minimum wage when I can
Hmm.
do this other thing. And now that I'm back to like not having sex work access anymore, that feels like very challenging, But like, yeah, the intimacy of being like, I still want my relationship with my partner and I want the intimacy there. So like what boundaries do I have to have in place with work and what kind of
Hmm.
communication do we have to have around this? And yeah, I think like I mean, sex work, but then like you said, like everything around it, like the communication, all of that stuff, it was extremely transformational. And like
Mm.
I'm absolutely not the same person that I would have been if I'd chosen a different path or if I hadn't explored all of that. And it makes it really hard to like fully forever close that door. Like I always hated the term like retired. Like I don't
Hmm.
want to be like retired or retired sex worker.
But the majority of us go back and forth, or I don't know if
Yeah,
that's totally true, but
I think it
I
is.
know Raven Bowen did a study on it, and I think that was the reflection of her data, was that the majority of us go back and forth in and out of the industry. And
Yeah,
I definitely am one of those people. I mean, that's the reason my book was, it encapsulates 27 years of going in and out of the industry and the reasons why I went back.
yeah,
And the whole point you made about what's really degrading, really, to me, pouring ketchup into bottles and cleaning up people's messy tables and then having them yell at me because they didn't like the food or something, that's degrading to me.
yeah,
I've done it and I would do it again if I had to make a living. I'm not
yeah.
saying that, it's a horrible job, but jobs all have their good points and their bad points. And to me personally, working for minimum wage, especially, or any kind of low hourly rate, and then also on top of it, either not being appreciated or actually being treated like shit, that's way more degrading than
Yeah.
taking off my clothes and being admired and having money thrown at me. You know?
Yeah. I mean, like, I think the foundational thing that I hear you saying there and that I kind of always come back to as well, it's just that like sex work is work. And
Mhm.
we know that, we say that like over and over again, but that is what it comes down to. And we get to make the decision about what is degrading and what isn't. I
Yes.
don't think there's like, I think under capitalism, the fact that like people do have to work for minimum wage, that is degrading. But like there's a scene in the book where I talk about, cleaning out a garbage can at like some cafe that I was working at, it just being like full of maggots and being like,
Oh.
why is this the thing that I'm supposed to do? Or like the climbing the ladder or something like that. I think especially because I was never interested in like a corporate position, it
Mhm.
felt like there was never anywhere to go up. And it
Yeah.
was only through sex work that I was able to access. Like for 10 years there, I didn't really worry too much about paying rent. And
Hmm.
that's not something I can say since quitting or since not being able to access that work. And I think I'm very interested and I will be reading your memoir, but I'm very interested in like the moving in and out of it because when I like stopped doing the work, people were like, "Great, you've like quit forever." And like I still like I dream of it. Like I dream all the time of like
Me
being
too.
in the club like, all the time. It's just like it feels like a second home in some
It
ways.
became a part of us, right?
Yeah. Even though
Like
it
so
wasn't
intensely.
necessarily like safe or good all the time, and even though there
No.
was a lot of negativity, like a lot of those dreams are like, it's a slow night, my makeup is shit, I don't have my clothes, like I don't know what
They're all
song I'm
stress
doing, like
dreams for me.
stress, 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 yeah, for sure. But like
Forgot my
it's
shoes. I'm late for my show.
always I'm forgetting the shoes. Yeah. I'm always there in like runners in my dreams being like, what did I think?
I've had dreams where I only have one shoe and then I find my other shoe, but now I can't find my music.
Oh yeah.
And I also
But there's
had
so many like,
I've been on stage like in my dream and I'm pregnant and I'm trying to hold in my
oh
gut.
yeah.
That's a weird one.
But I
Sorry.
think that just reflects that there's so many reasons that people move in and out of that work. And for me, I think I
Mm.
heard you talking about this before, maybe I saw it on your profiles, but like about like physical and mental illness. Like mental illness forced me to take like periods of time and breaks,
Mhm.
and like those crises were not a result of the work, they were like mental health. And mental health was the reason that I couldn't really maintain other jobs. Like I would
Yes,
get a job and then I would quit in 3 months. And I didn't quit stripping like that because you could just not show up for a week and nobody
exactly.
cared. You could like very much make your own schedule. And then in terms of physical health, for me, like the chronic pain became,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's sort of like the reason of the exit in the memoir that I wrote was because the physical pain became too much, and combined with burnout, combined with
Mm.
emotional burnout, and anger at, like, yeah, when the burnout became actual anger towards the clients, it just was like I couldn't make money anymore doing that because I was
Yes.
just too angry at them.
Yeah, I can
But for
relate.
sure, it's like I can hear it. It's like a song, and I'm just kind of always picking it up and hearing it in the air and being like, "There's money out there that I'm not making."
I
That's
love
it.
that analogy. It's like a song. I love that.
Yeah.
It's so true.
Never forget the words.
Yeah, and that was another thing that I really did relate to in your book as well when you were talking about health issues. And I have struggled with mental health issues mostly in the context of my physical health issues because at times when I just was suicidal just because I was just so sick and sick of being
Mm,
sick, and struggling, and it was just so hard, and being in a shitty marriage and just so many things going on. But I feel like mental health, physical health, it doesn't really matter which one you're struggling with. It's a disability. It interferes with your ability to function and hold down jobs, and sex work is an industry that has a lot of people with disabilities because what else would we
absolutely.
do? How else could
Yeah.
I put my child in her theater program that she absolutely fucking loves? I wouldn't be able to. There's so many things that because of my disability, this has been sex work has been really, it saved me and provided for my family. It's nothing is always perfect, right? There's going to be
Hmm.
shitty things. And I've gone through periods where I'm burnt out and I start to really hate my work, and that is when I have to take a step back. But that would happen no matter what job I had.
Absolutely.
But in
Yeah.
terms of sex work, like I feel like working in the strip clubs for me, I had a harder time keeping my um perspective with my clients just because you have to put up with so many drunk guys all the time.
Hmm.
And so even if 95% of them are drunk, respectful guys and only 5% are vulgar asshole guys, that 5% can just be so vulgar and such assholes that it just makes your walls go up and you get like kind of towards everybody, and in my in-person work, it's a lot easier because I can just change things up. I can be like, well, I'm not taking any clients for a week, or I'm not going to take these kinds of clients, or I'm going to say no to this client, but I'm going to say yes to this client, and
Yeah.
and I don't have to deal with the drunks because I can
Hmm.
be, very picky about when I work and who I allow into my workspace. But yeah, it's definitely like even some of my regulars, I found times where I know I'm getting burnt out when they start to annoy me. And I'm like,
Totally.
okay, I'm starting to feel like this is a boyfriend that I wish would just like go home. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I have one of the characters in the book talk about it's a scene where the girls are all getting ready to go to a club and one of them is pretty nervous and she's like, "Oh, I really prefer escorting. Like I don't like the performance. I don't like the competition. I want when a guy shows up, I want my client to like be there for me and not to like have to fight." And not all people
Mhm.
experience a strip club as like fighting for clients. I didn't
Yeah.
really feel that way. Sometimes I did, but like
Yeah.
that's how she felt. And
Hmm.
one of the beautiful things about sex work is that there's such a diversity of jobs under the umbrella.
Mhm.
Like you're not relegated to only one thing. And for a while that did work for me. And I don't need to go into all that, but like of switching between different kinds of
Mhm.
jobs, I wasn't only doing stripping. There's like a number of other things that you can kind of like
Yeah.
pass and move through when you're dealing with burnout from one kind of situation or context while
Mhm.
still being able to do sex work.
Mhm.
And for me, that was how I knew the burnout was sort of like total, is when like switching lanes just wasn't offering the relief
Mhm.
from the anger. Um,
That's very
yeah, but I
good
think like
insight for yourself, like introspection.
yeah, yeah, and
Sorry
that
for
like
interrupting.
oh, that's okay. But just that like patriarchal anger and like I have a lot of anger at the patriarchy, and like often that does come out or would come out like at specific clients who are being dicks for like whatever reason.
Mhm.
But I do have a lot of anger at that kind of like overall system, at like violence against women, and so that's stuff that is mine to hold now, and I'm not really sure like what exactly to do with that going forward, but
Mhm.
I do know that like doing super introverted stuff, like writing historical fiction novel, offers me some distance from that, even though I'm still dealing with themes of, patriarchy and literally violence against women. Like there's
Mhm.
those things, but I do have like the personal, the physical distance with which to kind of look at these like bigger themes,
And
It's kind
in
of nice to have
recovery,
that
they
break.
refer to that as resentments, right? Like for me,
Yeah.
when I was going through, I've done the 12-step program too, and I'm sober one month today again.
Wow, congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you. I'm one of those people they call a functioning alcoholic. I'm willing to admit that.
Hmm.
But I quit drinking before COVID, started drinking again during COVID, and now I have just stopped again
Wow.
in the last month. So
Huge.
yeah, but I know for me when I was doing this 12 steps, one of my resentments was an institutional, because they say there are institutional resentments as well. And when you say
Totally.
the patriarchy, that's what I thought of. And for me, a really huge institutional resentment that I've struggled with is the medical system. And
Mm,
like I've had like hate, like serious hate for all doctors and all people. And like I would like
yeah.
fantasize about like blowing up the clinic. And like, I mean, I went through so much trauma at the
Yeah.
hands of medical professionals. And also I had a lot of really wonderful medical professionals too, but they were they were just dwarfed by the horrible experiences, of course, because when you're really vulnerable and you're in pain or you're suffering in any way, and violence against women is another example of that. It just it erases everything else. And for me, healing that resentment has taken like just consistent and constant reframing.
Mm,
And I've had partly it's been meeting people. So I've had a couple of clients who are doctors who are really
huh.
wonderful.
Yeah.
And that melted some of my hatred and anger towards doctors. And then also just reminding myself and telling myself over and over that the system is broken and the people are just victims of the system. So doctors, nurses, people, they're victims of the same system that I have resentments towards, which is the medical system. And so maybe perhaps that you could use that with the patriarchy, that these people that are causing damage in the name of patriarchy are victims of the patriarchy because it's the system that's broken and it's created these people to be the way they are. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So like
Men
being
for
able
sure
to
are hurt by.
forgive and heal in terms of the people, human aspect of it, while understanding that the institutional aspect of it is broken. And for me, what I really believe and how I try to frame things for myself now, because it's helped a lot with my mental health, is to not see the institution in the people. That's
Mm,
that's the hard part, and kind of trying to separate that and realizing that I believe that we can heal these systems and institutions through cooperation and love and forgiveness and acceptance. And so the people who are really hurting, like fighting against them isn't, or like who are hurting people, I should say, fighting against them is only going to make them reject our ideas more. And when we open up our hearts and our minds and able to allow those people, maybe not into our lives because they're fucking toxic, but just to not let their violence or their discrimination or whatever it is become a part of uh, how we see the world. You know what I mean? So, and it's hard. Like, I mean, I grew up very poor and around a lot of addiction and with family members that were very not hostile towards the world, but put walls up. And so I learned not to trust anyone, not to trust anything, and I never did. And I still don't. I don't trust anyone. But what I can say now is that I love everyone and I trust no one. And that's my goal. That's my goal. Obviously, it's hard. I can't always do it, but the goal is to love them even if I don't trust them, and to love them from afar if I really don't like what they're doing. Because if I have them in my presence, then I'm going to grow to hate them. You know? I don't know. That's just kind of my rambling when it comes to dealing with that kind of shit. But we have gone over our hour. I'm so sorry. Is there anything that you'd like to add from what I just said before I hustle us off this?
No, I mean, I really appreciate this talk. Like, I am certain now that this is the only time I've been interviewed by a sex worker, just the quality of the conversation and the specificity that we were able to get to. I didn't feel like I had to kind of cover sort of basics, first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like uh maybe one thing I would add is like if you are a sex worker who wants to get involved, or if you're like an ally, there's a lot of like buy-in for organizations across the country, some of them which I like list in the back of my book. But you can find them through like Google and stuff like that too. Those orgs always need like volunteer work of all kinds. And then other ways that you can like support sex workers are like buying and consuming their art. I reviewed a really beautiful documentary recently called Fly in Power, that was really beautiful, that people can check out. And and yeah, just support your local friend and sex worker who is trying to tell their story. Like I know some people who are working on a play. I know some people who are working on like storytelling. And like remember that if you are somebody who is working on that, that your story is important and that people want to hear it. And you'll be supported too. People will support you back. So
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm amazed. Like our community is, I see a lot of people trash talking our community. Like I have never made friends with another sex worker. They always stab you in the back. I've seen stuff like that on Twitter. And I've experienced some of that too. I mean, every community has all kinds of people in it.
Totally.
But for the most part, I've found a very supportive community that, I mean, they help me with my books and my book launches and promoting them and just
Totally.
like, and you like people like you agreeing to come on my podcast. I mean, this is the camaraderie that we can find in this industry that a lot of, especially women, don't find anywhere else,
Yeah, totally.
And I'm sorry for if I used any inappropriate references to gender or language during
Oh, that's
this
okay. Yeah,
podcast.
that's
I'm still
okay.
I'm old. I'm 50 and I'm still adjusting.
Yeah, it was kind of like that was one of the fun parts about because like I changed my pronoun kind of like I was able to explore my gender. I felt like more authentically after not needing to present so hyper feminine all the time.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so my character is she, her, and then how I am now is they, them. So yeah,
Okay, okay,
it's
cool.
confusing, I'm sure.
No worries. My daughter is, she says I can call her my daughter, and she is she, her, but she says she's identifies as non-binary,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
she's 13 now. And I honestly think if we had that kind of language when I was 13, I probably would have too. I was quite the tomboy.
Mm-hmm.
Only in the last few years have I started to wear like colorful colors, and it's just because I wore black my whole life, and now I really want to just like I want to do something different.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Good for
But
your child. That's
but
great.
yeah, it's such an interesting world that we live in now, that where we can explore ourselves so much more deeply, I think.
Hmm.
But thank you so much for being on my podcast. Where can people find you?
Yeah. So I've been taking social media breaks these days, but I'm on Instagram and I have a website. And if you want to work with me, I do editing. So if you have like a manuscript that you want to bring towards publication, I'm also a working editor. So yeah,
Awesome.
yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This was really great.
Yeah, and I will put those links for your to get in contact with you or follow
Oh
you
yeah, and
in
you
the
can buy my book.
description.
Obviously, you can buy my
Yeah,
book.
buy
That'd
the
be
book,
great.
buy our books.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm Annie Temple, the erotic entrepreneur. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much.